My father scoffed. Why can't you just help your sister? When I refused to hand over the house I spent a decade paying for, so I met his stare and said, then you can give her yours instead. The whole mess started with a phone call on a Thursday night while I was standing in my kitchen with one shoe off and a frozen pizza in the oven. I had just gotten home from work, my back hurt, and I was already in one of those moods where even the sound of the refrigerator humming felt annoying. My father called rarely enough that I always noticed when his name lit up my screen. That alone should have warned me something was wrong. I answered thinking it would be one of his usual practical calls about the yard at the old family house or some random bill he had forgotten to forward. Instead, he went straight into the kind of tone he used when he had already decided I was being difficult before I had even said anything. He told me my younger sister was in trouble and that I needed to step up. He did not start with details. He started with guilt. That was his favorite order of operations. My sister, Marissa, had apparently fallen behind on rent again. Her husband had moved out 2 months earlier, though my father said that like it was a weather event instead of a consequence of the way she had been living for years. Now she had a kid, some credit card debt, and a landlord who was getting impatient. According to my father, the obvious solution was for me to let her move into the house I had been paying for since I was 26. Not rent it to her, not let her stay temporarily. Hand it over. He said it like he was asking me to move a piece of furniture out of the way. I remember standing there with my phone against my ear, looking at the unopened mail on the counter, trying to understand why he was talking as if my life was public property. The house he meant was a small 3-bedroom place on the edge of town. It was never some grand inheritance or hidden windfall. It was the house my mother had bought when my parents were still together, and things were only mostly broken instead of fully broken. After the divorce, my mother stayed there with Marissa and me for a while, then got sick, and then died faster than anyone expected. My father had already moved out by then and was living in a condo with a woman everyone politely called his friend until they finally got married 3 years later. I had kept paying the mortgage because my mother had asked me to before she died, not in some dramatic movie scene. She was sitting in a hospital bed, irritated by the food, annoyed by the noise, and trying very hard not to make her fear my problem. She told me not to let my father sell the house out from under us while everything was still tied up. She said it was the only place that still felt like ours. I had taken over the payments because I was the oldest, and because I was the only one with steady work at the time. I was making decent money, but not enough to comfortably carry a mortgage, utilities, taxes, repairs, and everything else for a place I did not even fully own yet. I did it anyway. At first, I told myself it would just be temporary. Then temporary became a year. Then the bank statements became part of my life. Then I fixed the roof. Then I replaced the furnace. Then I paid property taxes when my father forgot to. Then I took out a personal loan to cover a foundation repair after a winter storm cracked the back wall. Over time, the house stopped being an emergency and started being the thing I built my adult life around. I had lived in the spare bedroom for a while after my mother died, then moved out, then moved back in briefly after a breakup, then finally made my own apartment across town. But I never stopped paying. I was 36 by the time this call happened. The house had been mine in every practical sense for 10 years, even if the paperwork had always been a little messier than I liked. My father had kept insisting it was family property, which was a phrase he used when he wanted everyone to ignore that he had contributed almost nothing to it for a decade. He had not paid the mortgage. He had not paid for repairs. He had not paid the taxes. He had not even answered half the calls from the insurance company when the downstairs bathroom flooded. But because his name had once been on some of the older documents, he liked to act like he still had moral authority over the place. That was the problem. He had authority in his head, and for most of my life I had let that be close enough. Not this time. When I told him no, he acted like I had said something obscene. He said family should help family. He said Marissa was going through a hard time. He said I was being selfish over a house I did not even need. That last part made my jaw tighten because it was exactly the kind of nonsense he used when he wanted to make my reality sound optional. I asked him what he meant by need. I had a job, yes. I had an apartment, yes. I also had the mortgage, the tax bills, the maintenance, and the fact that the house represented a decade of my salary that I had sunk into a place I had quietly been stabilizing while everyone else treated it like some vague shared asset. He ignored all that and said Marissa needed it more. He said she had a child. He said her ex had stopped paying support. He said I was the only one being stubborn. That was when I realized he was not calling to ask. He was calling to pressure me until I gave in the way I usually did, and something in me just shut down. I was tired of that version of myself, the one who nodded and accepted being told I was being difficult whenever I had a boundary, so I told him I was not giving up the house. There was a pause. Then he scoffed and asked why I could not just help my sister. That was the moment the whole thing changed. I looked at the kitchen wall, still hearing the oven fan running, and I felt the kind of calm that only shows up when you are so past anger that your brain gets crisp and cold. I told him that if he wanted to help her so badly, then he could give her his house instead. He immediately said that was different. Of course it was different. It always was. The word different in my family usually meant the rules applied to me and the benefits applied to someone else. He tried to explain that his condo was too small, that he and my stepmother needed privacy, that Marissa would only be there temporarily, that I was overreacting. I did not argue. I just told him no again. Then I ended the call before he could turn the conversation into a sermon. I should say that if I had known how fast everything would spiral after that, I would have made popcorn first. The next morning I found 3 missed calls from him, 2 from Marissa, and 1 from my stepmother, Elaine. Elaine was not cruel the way my father could be. She was more polished about it. Her version of manipulation came with sympathy baked in. I ignored all of them until lunch, then listened to Marissa's voicemail because I assumed it would be the usual mix of frustration and tears. Instead, she sounded calm in a way that made me uneasy. She said she had already talked to Dad and that I was making things harder than they had to be. She said I was being unreasonable about a house that sat half empty. She said nobody was trying to steal anything from me. That phrasing caught my attention because it was too careful. People only say nobody is stealing when the idea has already crossed their mind. I drove over there that weekend because I wanted to get everything face to face. The old family house had changed over the years in the small, sad ways houses do when the people inside stop loving them equally. The front steps had a crack I had been meaning to repair. The mailbox was bent. The azaleas by the porch were overgrown because nobody had trimmed them in 2 seasons. Marissa's car was parked out front. That was not a surprise. What surprised me was seeing a second car I did not recognize and hearing voices inside when I walked up. I did not go in right away. I stood by the side of the porch and looked through the front window. My father was at the dining table with a folder open in front of him. Elaine was there too, wearing her neat cardigan and that expression she used when she wanted to seem reasonable. Marissa had a pile of papers in front of her and looked like she had already been crying. There was also a man I did not know in a cheap suit with a briefcase. I felt my stomach tighten. I knocked and walked in before anyone could pretend I had not seen enough. My father looked startled, then immediately annoyed that he was the one caught off guard. The man in the suit introduced himself as a real estate agent. That was the first truly bad sign. Nobody had told me they were looking at selling anything. Marissa froze like a child caught hiding something broken. I asked what was going on. My father said we were discussing options. I asked what options. He said Marissa needed a place to live and the house was too much for one person to maintain. That was his answer for everything. If the truth was ugly, call it maintenance. If it was theft, call it family support. If it was a bad idea, call it an option. I looked at the real estate agent and asked why he was there. He answered carefully and said my father had reached out about a potential sale and wanted to know the current market value. My father tried to interrupt him, but the damage was already done. The room went so quiet that I could hear the air conditioner clicking. I asked my father why he was trying to sell the house. He said he was not trying to sell it. He was trying to do what was best for the family. That was when Elaine leaned forward and said Marissa could not keep paying rent where she was, and it would make more sense for all of us if the house were sold and the proceeds were divided in a way that helped everyone. There it was. The little slippery word, divided, not reimbursed, not settled, divided. Like I had spent 10 years contributing to a common pot instead of carrying the place on my own back. I asked who exactly had decided this. My father looked irritated that I needed to be included in the decision. He said we were all adults. I told him that adults do not make financial decisions about property they do not own and then present them as favors. The real estate agent looked like he desperately wanted to be somewhere else. Marissa began crying again, but I could tell the tears were partly because she had finally realized I was not going to collapse and say yes. I asked to see the folder on the table. My father said no at first. I asked again. He finally pushed it across. Inside were printouts of the house value, a rough appraisal, and a proposal for a sale. The proposal had Marissa listed as an intended beneficiary of the proceeds, not me. That was the moment my calm almost broke. I did not shout. I did not throw the papers. I just asked why my name was missing from a document about a house I had been paying for over a decade. My father gave me a look that I still remember because it was the look he always used when he assumed I would eventually forgive him for being unfair. He said I had been living my life. He said I could afford to help. He said Marissa could not. He said I was making this into a business transaction when it was really about family. That sentence made me laugh once in disbelief because the hypocrisy was so dense it felt physical. I told him I wanted the mortgage statements, the tax records, and every repair receipt from the last 10 years. He looked irritated again, then said those things were not necessary. I said they were necessary for me. He said he did not have them all on hand. I told him I would wait. That was the first time I saw fear flicker across his face, not because he was innocent, because he knew exactly how much paper I had been ignoring. Up until then, I had assumed the house was held in a neat little arrangement I could untangle later if I needed to. I had been mailing checks to an account my father claimed was connected to the mortgage. I had been paying the property taxes through an online portal I had set up years before. I had kept almost every email, but not all the physical paperwork, because like an idiot I trusted that no one in my own family would try to turn the place into a bargaining chip. I left before the argument turned into anything uglier. On the drive home, I called the bank. That was when the story started to crack open. The mortgage account was in my name and my father's name together. Except the last 5 years of statements showed something I had never noticed before. My checks had been covering more than the minimum payment. A lot more. Not because I had chosen a fancy accelerated payoff plan, but because the original loan had been modified after my mother died, and my father had quietly taken a cash-out refinance 2 years later. He had told me it was to cover emergency expenses and to keep the house afloat. What he had not told me was that the refinance had pulled out almost $60,000 in equity, and because my name was still on the loan, the bank had treated me as equally liable. The money had gone into an account that was not mine. That part alone made me sit in my car in the grocery store parking lot and stare at my phone for a long time. I kept thinking surely there was some innocent explanation. Maybe he had used it for medical bills. Maybe he had paid off debt tied to the house. Maybe he had fixed the roof or dealt with some catastrophic issue I simply never saw. So I pulled records. I spent the next 2 nights digging through my emails, old tax returns, bank statements, and the digital folder I had built up over the years of every repair quote I had approved. By Sunday afternoon, I had enough to make my hands shake. The refinance money had not gone into the house. A chunk had gone into paying off my father's condo improvements. Another portion had gone to Elaine's daughter from a previous marriage, supposedly as a temporary help for college expenses. There were also withdrawals that lined up with Marissa's wedding costs. Not all of them, just enough to tell me that my father had been using the house like a private bank account while I was paying the actual bills. I sat there at my desk and felt a kind of humiliation that was hard to describe because it was not one giant betrayal. It was 10 years of small betrayals arranged neatly into folders. I had paid for the furnace while he had paid for someone else's vacation. I had covered the taxes while he had used equity for his wife's daughter. I had repaired the bathroom while Marissa had gotten a wedding paid for by the house I thought I was protecting. I did not call him immediately. That would have been satisfying in a dumb way, and I was too angry to be useful. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer recommended by a coworker whose brother handled property disputes. I had never hired a lawyer for anything in my life. The office was plain and smelled like old carpet and coffee. The lawyer was a woman named Denise who looked like someone who had seen every variation of family nonsense and had no patience left for performance. I brought everything I had: mortgage records, tax payments, bank statements, receipts for repairs, email threads, text messages, photos of the house before and after the foundation issue. The folder was thick enough to be embarrassing. Denise asked me a few questions, and then sat back in her chair with her eyebrows slightly raised. She said my father had done several things that were, at minimum, deeply inappropriate and possibly fraudulent depending on the exact wording of the refinance and title documents. She said the first thing we needed to do was establish the ownership history clearly. She also said I should stop discussing the situation with family members except through writing. That part mattered more than I realized at the time. I had grown up believing family disputes were supposed to get handled by emotional weather and vague promises. Denise treated it like accounting. That was comforting. She asked me to get the deed, the title insurance paperwork, and the refinance documents. I told her I did not think my father would hand them over willingly. She said that was fine. We could request them. She also recommended I stop paying any new expenses related to the house until I knew exactly who owned what. That advice scared me more than anything else, because it meant there was a real possibility I had been paying into a structure that was never as stable as I believed. I left her office feeling like I was walking around with a loaded secret in my pocket. That night, I texted my father and asked for copies of every document related to the house. He replied the next morning saying he would look. 2 days later, he sent me a blurry photo of an old deed from years ago and said that should be enough for now. It was not enough. He knew it. I knew it. The deed showed the house had originally been in my mother's name alone. After her death, it had transferred into both mine and my father's names through probate, which I vaguely remembered signing because I was grieving and exhausted, and nobody had explained the consequences in a way I understood. That alone did not make me feel better. It made me feel stupid. What followed was worse. The refinance paperwork showed that my father had signed as a co-borrower and had used the house equity to consolidate debt. There was a signature line with mine on it too, except I had not signed it. The signature looked like a sloppy imitation of mine, not so bad that it screamed fake to a casual glance, bad enough that once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I stared at that document for a long time. I had this weird floating sensation, like my brain was trying to step away from itself. I kept checking my own old signatures on tax forms and school paperwork. The forged one was close, but not close enough. I did not know yet whether my father had done it himself, or whether Elaine had helped, or whether some loan officer had failed to notice what should have been obvious. I only knew the paperwork that had supported years of my money going into the house had probably not been what I thought it was. Denise told me to save everything and not to accuse anyone in writing until she reviewed the documents. So I did what she said. That was harder than yelling would have been. A week later, Marissa showed up at my apartment unannounced with her son in tow. She looked tired, which was nothing new, but there was also something cornered in her face that I had not seen before. She asked to talk. I let her in because she had brought my nephew, and because despite everything, I still loved her. That part is important. People who read stories like this always want one clean villain. I did not have that. I had a father who was manipulative and controlling, yes. I had a sister who had spent years benefiting from whatever version of the family story made her feel safest. But she was also the person who sat on my couch with her kid coloring on the coffee table and admitted she had not understood half of what Dad had told her. She said he told her the house had always been partly hers. He had told her I was the one blocking her from getting stable. He had told her I made plenty of money and was being dramatic. She said she only found out the house sale plan was real when she saw the agent in the house and realized I was not involved. That did not erase anything, but it changed the shape of it. I asked her if she knew about the refinance. She said no. I asked her if she knew my name had been signed on documents I never saw. She said she did not. She looked genuinely shaken. I believed her enough to think she was not lying about that part. What she did know, apparently, was that my father had told her he could make things work if she just trusted him and stopped listening to me being difficult. She had trusted him because that was what she had been trained to do. That was the sad part. My father had not just manipulated me. He had built a whole family system around controlling what each person knew. He kept me responsible, Marissa dependent, and Elaine politely detached. It was efficient in a disgusting sort of way. Marissa asked what was going to happen. I told her I did not know yet. That was true. I also told her I was not giving her the house, and I was not letting anyone sell it out from under me, but I would be fair about whatever the legal truth turned out to be. She cried then, but more quietly than before. Before she left, she said she had no idea Dad had used the house money for her wedding. That was the first time I saw real guilt from her. It did not fix anything, but it made it harder for me to treat her like a complete stranger. A few days after that, I got a call from the bank's fraud department. I almost did not answer because I assumed it would be another spam call. Instead, the woman on the line asked me to confirm whether I had authorized the refinance signature. I said no. She asked if I would be willing to come in with identification and review the file. That was the first concrete moment when the thing stopped being a family argument and started becoming an institutional problem. The bank had noticed discrepancies after Denise requested copies of the records, and the signatures had been flagged for verification. I spent 2 hours in a conference room at the branch, while a bank investigator compared my current signature to the refinance paperwork. The investigator was polite in the way professionals get when they already know the answer but need to document every step. He said the signature appeared inconsistent. He said the notary information was incomplete. He said the loan officer at the time had since left the bank. He said they were opening an internal review. That afternoon, I felt less angry and more nauseated. It was one thing to suspect my father had lied. It was another to hear a bank employee calmly say the paperwork might not be valid. Denise had me file a formal dispute. She also had me send a certified letter to my father demanding that no one further encumber or market the property without my consent. That letter probably did more to wake him up than any argument could have. He called me 10 times that night. I did not answer. He left voicemails alternating between outrage and wounded disappointment. I deleted most of them after listening to the first 10 seconds. The one I kept was the one where his voice changed in the middle and he started saying he had only ever tried to protect the family. That line was so ridiculous I almost laughed. Protect the family by forging signatures and diverting equity. Protect the family by setting his daughter up to blame me for a situation he created. Protect the family by assuming I would pay forever and then surrender the house when someone else needed it. The next confrontation happened at his place, not because I wanted it that way, because he insisted on a family meeting. He texted that this was ridiculous and we needed to sort it out like adults. He said Elaine and Marissa would be there. He said he had the papers. I brought Denise. That was the smartest thing I did all year. His condo was a modern little place with too much glass and not enough warmth. Marissa was on the couch with her son playing on the floor. Elaine stood in the kitchen doorway with a face that said she already regretted being there. My father waited until I sat down before beginning his performance. He said I had overreacted. He said Marissa was about to lose her apartment. He said he had a proposal that would solve everything. He had printed out a new plan. The plan involved me transferring my share of the house to him. He would refinance again. Marissa would use the proceeds to buy a smaller place, and I would be compensated later. I remember Denise saying nothing at first. She just sat there and listened. Then she asked whether he could explain why the refinance records included a signature that did not match mine. He tried to act confused. She asked whether he could explain why the notary log was missing pages. He said that was a clerical issue. She asked whether he could explain why my bank records showed I had been paying the mortgage by direct debit while his refinance proceeds went to unrelated expenses. He looked at me then, not her. That was when I saw it clearly. He had always assumed I was the weak link. He thought I would crack under guilt before he had to face consequences. Denise calmly listed the legal risks, the bank review, and the possibility of a fraud investigation if the signatures were not valid. My father's face changed little by little as the air left the room. He was not used to being in a room with someone who knew how to make his vague moral language collapse under documentation. He tried one more time to frame it as a family misunderstanding. Then he asked me again why I could not just help my sister. I looked at him and realized he still did not understand the shape of his own lie. He thought the issue was that I was withholding generosity. He had never understood that the issue was that he had already taken generosity from me for years and repackaged it as obligation. I told him I would not hand over a house I had spent a decade paying for, especially not after he forged documents and used the equity for other people. I told him if he wanted to help Marissa, he could give her his own place instead. That line landed harder the second time because now there were witnesses. His jaw tightened. Elaine looked away. Marissa started crying again, but this time I could see she finally understood the scale of what had happened. My father said I was trying to humiliate him. Denise said no, he had done that himself by continuing to defend a transaction the bank was already reviewing. That sentence knocked the fight out of him for a moment. He did not apologize. He did not confess. He just sat back like the whole room had become foreign territory. After that meeting, things moved faster. The bank placed a hold on any further refinancing or sale activity tied to the property. Denise filed a formal petition to separate the ownership interests and establish reimbursement for all the payments I had made. That process was uglier than I expected. It involved years of old records, utility bills, tax receipts, repair invoices, and a level of patience I did not know I still possessed. I had to relive everything in a spreadsheet, every payment, every repair, every time I had written a check because someone in my family told me it was temporary or necessary or for the greater good. The more I documented, the more obvious the pattern became. My father had not just used the house as a backup fund. He had repeatedly asked me to cover just one more thing while he made decisions that benefited everyone but me. When the bank's internal review finished, they found irregularities serious enough to refer the matter to counsel. I was not part of the criminal side of it, and I did not want to be if I could avoid it, but I was contacted for statements. That is where the emotional cost started hitting me in places the legal paperwork had not. My father was now being treated by institutions the way he treated everyone else, which meant he suddenly wanted compassion and nuance. He called my office one afternoon after I had instructed everyone to put all communication in writing. He left a message saying he never meant for it to go this far. That phrase made me angrier than yelling would have. He had meant for it to go exactly as far as it needed to go until I gave up. He just had not expected me to stop. Marissa called too. This time she sounded different. She told me Dad had asked her to take the house with him if I sold my share. She told me she had said no. She told me she had started looking at her own numbers and realized she had been using child support and family help to stay afloat while believing the house money would save her. She was not innocent exactly, but she was finally looking at the reality instead of the story he had fed her. That mattered because it changed who was standing where. Elaine, predictably, tried to stay above it all until the bank sent letters to every address connected to the property. Then she started calling me with a much more careful tone. She said my father had made mistakes. She said the family should not be destroyed over them. She said no one could have predicted it would get this serious. That last line almost made me throw my phone. The seriousness had been there for a decade. Nobody had to predict it. They just had to pay attention. When the appraisal dispute began, I discovered something else that explained a lot. The refinance my father had taken out had never actually reduced the principal the way he had claimed. He had rolled part of the debt forward, missed several smaller obligations, and let penalties accumulate in a way that made the house look healthier on paper than it really was. If I had not pulled the records when I did, I might have eventually been stuck with a property that had more hidden liabilities than value. That realization made me physically sick for a day. I had spent years thinking I was being responsible. In reality, I had been subsidizing a fraud machine built around my own sense of duty. Denise did a good job keeping me grounded. She kept saying the documents would tell the story if I let them. She was right. They did. When the settlement discussions finally started, my father's tone changed completely. He went from accusatory to wounded to apologetic in the space of a week. He sent me a handwritten letter, which was somehow even more insulting than the voicemails, because he probably thought pen and paper would make him seem sincere. He wrote about stress and age and how family should not turn on each other over money. He did not admit to forging anything. He did not admit to using house equity for unrelated expenses. He did not admit to trying to sell a property without my consent. He just said he had hoped I would be the bigger person. I showed the letter to Denise. She read it, snorted once, and told me to save it. The settlement took months. That part was miserable in a different way because it was slow. Slow meant there was room for hope. Hope is dangerous in family cases. Every time my father sent a softened email or my sister asked whether we could all just move on, part of me wanted to say yes because yes would have been easier and emotionally cheaper. But easy had already cost me 10 years. I was done paying in the same currency. The final agreement gave me sole ownership of the house after a structured payout that accounted for my mortgage payments, tax payments, and documented repairs. My father was required to sign away any remaining claim. The refinance dispute led to a separate negotiation with the bank about the forged signature issue, and I was not the one left holding that mess. Some of the benefits that had been diverted into unrelated uses were clawed back through settlement adjustments. It was not a huge windfall. It was not revenge. It was just enough to make the math stop lying. I remember sitting at the table in Denise's office when the last version of the agreement was printed. My father signed after looking like he had swallowed a rock. Marissa signed the acknowledgement because she was listed in some of the family disclosures and wanted to make clear she was not contesting the property itself. Elaine did not sign anything important, but she was there long enough to understand she had lost the ability to stand in the middle and act surprised. When it was over, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. There was a relief in it, yes, a deep one, but there was also grief, not because I wanted the old dynamic back, because the old dynamic was poisonous. I grieved the version of my father I had kept hoping existed under all that control. I grieved how much of my adult life had been spent trying to earn basic fairness. I grieved that Marissa and I had spent years on different sides of a story our father had written for us. The aftermath was strange. My father stopped calling. Then he started again, but only in short bursts that sounded rehearsed. Marissa and I talked more honestly than we had in years. She admitted she had believed him, because believing him meant she did not have to deal with how unstable her own life had become. I admitted I had ignored warning signs because I wanted to think sacrifice would eventually turn into respect. That conversation was probably the first real adult one we had ever had. Elaine kept things polite at family events and mostly avoided the topic. She invited me to dinner once like nothing had happened. I declined, not because I wanted drama, because I was still learning how to be around people who had watched me carry a burden and assumed that meant I could carry more. The house itself needed work after everything settled. Some repairs had been deferred too long. The back fence was leaning. The water heater was on its last legs. The kitchen floor near the sink had a soft spot from an old leak. I spent 6 weekends fixing things I had once patched in panic and then ignored. There was something almost therapeutic about doing the work after the legal fight ended. This time, I was not repairing a lie. I was repairing my own place. I did eventually move into it for a while, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand what 10 years of obligation had actually bought me. The first night there felt awkward in a way I had not expected. The rooms were too quiet. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and dust. I kept seeing pieces of my mother in the corners of the house. Her shoes by the door, her mug in the kitchen cabinet, the chair where she had sat with bills spread across her lap, trying not to worry us. I cried in the living room for a while, which I had not done since I was a teenager. It was not glamorous, it was just honest. A few months later, Marissa found a better apartment on her own, not perfect, just stable. She called to tell me she had done the paperwork herself and signed the lease without asking Dad to co-sign anything. That sounded small, but it mattered. I think she understood that the house was never really about the house. It was about who got to be helped and who got to be used. My father never truly admitted what he had done. He sort of hovered around the edges of it for a while, acting like the legal outcome had been unfortunate but understandable. That was the closest he came to accountability. He told one cousin that I had overcomplicated a simple family matter. He told another that I had always been too sensitive about money. That used to bother me more than it does now, because he can tell whatever version of the story he wants. The records are what they are, and once you have a bank investigator, tax filings, mortgage history, repair receipts, notarized inconsistencies, and a settlement agreement sitting in a folder, family mythology loses a lot of power. The strongest part of the whole thing was not that I got the house. It was that I got to stop pretending my sacrifice would magically teach people to respect me. It did not. It just taught them I was available. The strongest thing I did was finally act like my own labor had value. I stayed calm when he pushed. I kept records when he assumed I would not. I got a lawyer when he thought embarrassment would be enough. I let the facts do what the facts do when people have built too much of their life around a lie. A year after the settlement, I sat on the back porch with coffee and watched the sun come up over a fence I had repaired myself. The house was no longer some symbolic burden passed around at family gatherings. It was just mine, not in a triumphant way, in a practical way. The mortgage was manageable. The taxes were current. The repairs were mine to choose instead of mine to be ambushed by. Marissa came by with her son a few weeks later for dinner. She brought takeout because she still has the habit of assuming everyone is too tired to cook after work. We did not talk about Dad much. We did not need to. The distance between us had shifted into something quieter and more honest. She told me her kid liked the old backyard better than the apartment balcony. I told her the yard still needed work. She laughed. It was one of the first easy laughs we had shared in years. My father is still alive and still himself, which is somehow the most frustrating possible outcome. He did not become a better man because the truth embarrassed him. People love neat redemptions in stories like this. Real life is less satisfying. Sometimes the person who made everything ugly just gets older inside the same bad habits. But the difference now is that he cannot reach into my life and move pieces around without paperwork and consequences. That is enough for me. I do not talk to him often. When I do, I keep it brief and written if possible. He hates that. I can live with that. The house, the one he thought I would surrender because he said family should help family, is still standing. So am I, and for the first time in my life with him, that meant the same thing.